pleasant hello, and thank you for joining the third in our Bridging the Accessibility Gap webinar series. We started this series a couple of months ago because we all believe that there is a need to talk more about and work toward finding better solutions for a problem that exists for most everyone who happens to have some sort of a disability. That is, websites are coming online more and more every day, somewhere in the neighborhood in the United States alone of 380 websites every minute, yet there is no systematic way that those websites are becoming accessible. And in fact, what we are generally finding is that less than 2% of the websites that come onto the internet every minute are accessible. Some of them might work, and many of them don't for one reason or another. It could be anything from pictures that aren't described. It could be anything from videos that are not properly captioned. It could be that the websites have blinking elements so that if a person with epilepsy goes to the website, they are unable to use it because it could cause seizures. It could be that the websites expect you to use a mouse, and there are those of us who have physical disabilities that can't use mice. Any number of different kinds of reasons why web accessibility doesn't exist but needs to. We defined the gap in great detail in our first webinar. We talked about some of the legal implications and some of the experiences that we had in our second webinar, and Josh Basile was on the second webinar and is joining me as a co-host on this one. Good afternoon to you, Josh.
Great to be here today, Mike. Thanks for having me on.
And we also have a guest today, Yuri Andrianov. And Yuri comes from Purdy's Chocolates. For those of you who can see his background, it's all chocolate. For those of us who can't, we're still waiting for ours, Yuri, just so you know. But we are here to talk today about the business aspects of making your website accessible. So why should people do that if you own a business? The reality is that at least 1 in 5 people in the world happen to have a disability. And because websites are not accessible to those people, the reality is that we don't get to use websites. We aren't able to go in and buy. We're not able to go in and do research. The material that is presented isn't accessible, any number of different things. The reality is, for a business, web access is extremely important, and it's important for everyone. And it's something that isn't all that magical to do, but we do need to do it. As I said before, websites need to be accessible for the over 20% of people who happen to have a disability in the world. The reality is that the Nielsen company 5 years ago did a study that shows that people with disabilities tend to be very brand loyal to websites and to companies that pay attention to them and recognize their value. And I can tell you from personal experience, being blind, I'm going to go back to websites that are available to me and that I can use. I'm going to go to them before I'm going to go to other sites, because clearly somebody has made enough of an effort to make the website accessible that I'm going to go back and use it because I can. Another issue with web accessibility is, in addition to the whole concept of brand loyalty, it also just makes your brand stronger. It shows the world that you care, and that's something that we should do. It deals with showing full inclusion for everyone. Also, there are those who would tell you, and rightfully so, that if you make your website accessible, it will improve your system optimization rankings with website search engines. And that's something that is relevant to do. There's another aspect of this, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it today, but the reality is that more and more companies or countries are actually beginning to recognize that there's a legal reason for making your websites accessible. Since 2017 in the United States alone, the number of lawsuits against website owners who do not make their websites accessible has risen by a factor of threefold. And that's because courts have started to recognize that the internet is a place of reasonable accommodation. Oh, yes, there are a few courts that have disagreed with that because they say the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, was passed in 1990, went into effect in 1991, and that was long before the internet, so the ADA can't possibly apply to websites. The reality is, however, that the Americans with Disabilities Act doesn't say that. The Americans with Disabilities Act talks about accessibility, talks about reasonable accommodations, talks about inclusion, and it doesn't mention internet, brick and mortar, or anything else. So the bottom line is that people are being sued because their websites are not accessible. It's unfortunate, but it is still the way it is. And so the reality is that making your website inclusive is something that should be done. The problem with the accessibility gap, in part, is that the traditional ways that people have made websites accessible isn't decreasing or lessening the gap. In fact, the gap continues to grow wider. And so technology and innovators are looking and finding additional ways that they can create web access on their sites. One such site that has found that is Purdy's Chocolates. And here to talk some about that is Yuri. And so Yuri, I want to welcome you to our webinar and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for the warm introduction. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Yuri, and I'm a Director of Digital and Direct Sales here at Purdys Chocolatier. For those of you who have never heard about Purdys, we are a Canadian chocolatier with a rich history. Next year, actually, we're going to celebrate our 115th birthday. We started in 1907. Now we have 81 retail locations across Canada. And to echo what Michael was just saying, it's not a secret that e-com sales are at an all-time high. Pandemic has left a long-lasting effect on the consumer landscape. What took years of change have happened in months, and offline spending largely shifted online. And so we started asking ourselves, what does it mean for our organization? One thing about Purdys, we are customer obsessed, and digital accessibility plays a significant role in this. I was looking at some studies over the weekend, and what I found out, actually 22% of Canadian population are considered disabled. So for us, it's essential that we create a connection and joy of our customers. And we aim to ensure that all of our customers have access that they require. So when we embarked on this journey, we started with accessibility audit. And after that, we evaluated multiple options. That's how we found accessiBe. And it quickly became apparent that there is so much value it could bring at a very reasonable cost for starters. And then what we learned after that, the integration portion was effortless for us. And the fact that we utilize artificial intelligence that checks our content regularly and making sure that content is compliant, well, that's remarkable. And now we actually initiated several internal projects in order to incorporate accessibility in our design, in our content and development activities. Overall, I must say that for the business right now, in this day and age, web accessibility is a must. And what we saw on our end, that the bounce rate, one of the measures that we use to see how well we're doing, the bounce rate for the important pages that we have on our website has decreased. So that's a significant improvement. And we do not even consider accessibility as a project that would have a definitive end date. For us, it's going to be an ongoing journey.
So it's that kind of that education once you learned that accessibility can be built in, and that maybe before you didn't know how maybe little the website was accessible, but building it into it now, it's, oh my God, I wish we had this from the beginning days. So that obviously it increases the customers, it makes it easier, it provides an option to make a website usable. I know, Mike, first of all, thank you, Purdy, for sharing a little bit about your journey. Mike, I don't know if the audience that might be new today know about your journey as well, but I would love to share mine.
Please.
So just to let anybody in the audience know, I am paralyzed below the shoulders. When I was a teenager, I was in a beach accident and I broke my neck. That changed my life forever. And since then, I've relied on technology to access the world, whether my wheelchair or the internet. And with COVID, it's just been so much more important that the internet is accessible because we've been stuck in the comfortable walls of our home. And I love so much of what you're saying, Yuri, about understanding that people are using your website a lot more to gain access to the awesome chocolates that you have. And for me, as a person with a disability, getting to a website from start to finish, too often you can get to a website, you can access the beginning pages, but then when you check out, they forgot to make the checkout accessible. Or you get to a website and you don't know what's clickable. So like for me, I use a mouth joystick or I use my keyboard on screen to navigate a screen to get from place to place. And a lot of times due to fatigue, every click matters. So you don't want to make somebody have to click a million times to get to where they need to go, but rather create an experience, a usable experience to kind of get them to benefit from the services or products that you have. So I love the fact that you have a delicious product that is now available to many abilities, which is fantastic. But Michael, tell me more about your unique journey as well.
And I would say to everyone, go to Purdy's and buy those sweet Georgia Browns. It is summer. My experience with websites comes from the fact that being totally blind, I don't have access to anything that is strictly visual on the website. So that could be pictures or other kinds of images. It could be it could possibly be charts. It could be videos that have no description. It could be text that may visually look well formatted, but from a verbal or audio standpoint, it may not. And especially in the last several months, being part of accessiBe, I've encountered websites that exhibit all of those different kinds of things. Tables that we expect to look one way, but were designed a different way. Websites that have elements or that have headings that we expect to be one way when we listen to them, but they were created differently. One of my favorite examples of headings is my website, where there is a very large piece of print. It's the largest print on the whole page, but it was not coded as a heading. It should have been coded as H1. And the reason for saying that is that with a screen reader, I can skip between headings and go, if I want to search down a page, I can search heading by heading. But this particular piece of print would never have shown up as a heading, except that when I made the website fully accessible and I used accessiBe for that, accessiBe looked at the heading or at the page and said, this isn't a heading, but it's the largest print on the page. So we're going to make it H1 because it's bigger than anything else. And that was right to do that. There are a number of things that need to be done to websites to make them totally usable. And the traditional way that's been done is with coding. People will go in and program that stuff and program all the different elements. And that works to a point, but it isn't scalable as it exists today. And the reality is, as I said earlier, the gap continues to grow. So Yuri, tell us a little bit more about, if you would, your accessibility trip. So you analyzed the whole concept of accessibility, and then what made you choose what you chose?
I think you're absolutely right, Michael, by saying that it's challenging for organizations to make sure that everything is properly coded, because not only it takes a lot of effort, it's not clear from the beginning how much impact it will have on overall experience. And in order to combat this, When I first looked at our audit, we started prioritizing different aspects of accessibility, what we should have, what we should start working right there at that moment. And we started also looking into other ways, like what's going on in the industry in general. Is there any way for us to streamline this web accessibility? And we landed with accessiBe. What caught my attention from the beginning is the fact that you do not necessarily have to change the code, because at the end of the day, different platforms would have some limitations in terms of what you can and you cannot do without involving developers. And so for us, because we want to deliver new experiences to the market quickly, it was critical that we have that AI component that essentially checks your website regularly and makes sure that everything is coded and tagged appropriately. When we started looking into that integration phase and what that would require us to do, it was a relief when we realized how easy it would be for us to have that solution on our website. And once we put everything together, we were amazed by how many features the solution has and how many different aspects it covers. So overall, personally, I consider accessiBe as a comprehensive solution that approaches accessibility from various angles, and that's what's important for us. Because at the end of the day, we want to reach wide audiences. And with that in mind, we would definitely need to provide accessible tools for our customers.
I'm curious, when you started looking at the whole concept of accessibility, did you have any specific disability in mind, or were you already in a mindset that said there might be a lot of different disabilities that need access, or what was your thought process when you began this?
To be honest with you, Michael, that didn't occur at that time. We were looking to make it according to the guidelines, but
Okay.
we didn't have a specific disability we would like to target. And I think this is that missing piece, because you do not think about it when you are tasked with this project, because everywhere you look, it will tell you need to follow these guidelines, but it doesn't necessarily tell you which specific disabilities it will help to resolve to some extent.
Yeah, and that was my point. But I'm glad that you were looking at it as a general issue across perhaps a lot of different disabilities. And I assume that over time you have learned what different accessibility functions were put in place on your website with accessiBe because of the different kinds of disabilities, what's done for different disabilities now?
That is true. And one of the revelations was a contrast. So we haven't considered contrast to be such a drawback, such a blocker for some of the users, but I'm glad that we are able to mitigate that by changing all these background colors where we needed to. And I think that's where things gets overlooked, and sometimes it needs to be happening at the time when design is happening, when the content planning is happening, when the development planning is happening at the same time. So that accessibility piece is covered not by just essentially one person. It's never one person's job. It's everyone on the digital team, on the creative team, on the marketing team has to be a part of. And I think that's where leadership comes in, because at the end of the day, responsibility comes from the bottom, but that direction comes from the top.
And it's great that you've made the conscious decision to really be inclusive. As you implemented accessiBe then, and that's the solution that you chose, have you found any things that you had to customize or to address in terms of the website once accessiBe was in, or while it was going in? Was there any work or a lot of work, or what did you have to do?
Absolutely. After we had a disability for, I would say, a month or so, we started changing the way how we think about accessibility, in a way that we would start creating the content with accessibility in mind. so that we can, even if you're not using the widget, the tool, you're still able to navigate the website. And that's as I said, this is an ongoing project. I think there is a lot of areas that we will cover in the coming months, but with the start of this project, what really stood out to us is that how well our audience resonating to these changes.
That's awesome. When you first were doing your research, trying to find what option and how to make your website accessible, and you found accessiBe, was it once you knew that you wanted accessiBe, how long did it take for you to get it on your site? Was it a quick process?
For us, it was a relatively quick process. We evaluated several options. The original idea was to essentially change some mechanics of the website to make it more accessible, and it's still in our roadmap. But at the same time, we wanted to have like a quick solution at the same time that will be there regardless while we do all the work. And accessiBe just filled that gap for us.
Is accessiBe now part of Yuri's website design and website process from now on? Do you envision Purdy's chocolate always using accessiBe?
I think even if we get to the point where we can say we are 100% compliant with all the guidelines, I think still we're going to use accessiBe to show us, is there any gaps, for instance, if we launch a new set of landing pages, right? Or if we make some changes to the existing ones, are we doing it right? Because I think that audit, that ongoing audit that's happening in the background would really help us to highlight that.
The thing that when I go to a website, having it be an accessible site is fantastic. And that's what we want. But then sometimes we all come with our own unique disabilities or unique abilities, however you want to put it, but it's having a site be usable for somebody's disability, or sometimes there's multiple types of disabilities that a person has, and it's being able to combine that with a tool. That's something that's been really helpful for me as I explore sites, and it would be so awesome to be able to have that as I go everywhere, but being able to have it when I went on your site to look at chocolates, it was fun to be able to explore your site with it. So I enjoyed that experience.
And to your point, Josh, now consumers, especially in a time like this, consumers are less forgiving. And our goal is to deliver on all these expectations to build loyalty and increase lifetime value.
That loyalty for me, so I have a nonprofit and I've mentored thousands of families since I was injured in 2004. And when you become a mentor, you recommend things that when you have good experiences. And whenever I find something that has a company or a business or service that treated me, it's like instantaneously when I know somebody else is having a problem, I'm like, this is the solution. This is a great option for you. And it's the disability community is just, Mike said it earlier, it's the most brand loyal community in the country. And too often we're forgotten. And when we're recognized and welcomed, it's just, we want to say thank you to businesses. So I personally just want to say thank you to you now. And obviously the fact that you have delicious chocolates, that's the icing on the cake there when you're able to get that at your front door.
The chocolate icing on the cake.
There you go.
Yeah. So how long has Purdy's been an accessible website? How long have you had this in place?
So we started with accessiBe, I want to say as early as January. So we have accessiBe widget on our website for 6 months.
Ooh. Okay.
And at the same time, we internally try to see and use all the best practices now to make sure that even if you land on one of our pages, you can get that accessible experience from the start.
Yes. And that is so important that right from the outset, once you land on the site and you enable whatever profile you want, then you have real accessibility, and that is so cool. It is very obvious. And I've compared the site both with accessiBe activated and with it not. And there is such a tremendous difference in various aspects of it. I've loved visiting the recipe pages that have a number of images on them, and there's no description of the images with accessiBe deactivated. And there's a lot of description of the various images once accessiBe becomes activated, and that really adds a lot of value. The best way, as I describe it, is if anyone has pictures on a website, they're there for a reason. And I've had people say to me, why do you care about what the pictures show on the website? And my response to that is, why did you put them up in the first place? If you have them up there, you have them there for a reason. Why shouldn't I have the same access to the information about those pictures as everyone else? Why shouldn't you be using those pictures in some way to give me more information about your product or to sell me more on your product as you do everyone else? And that's what's so wonderful about the whole concept of true and real inclusion. If you accept that right from the beginning, then you want to make sure that everything on your website is available to me or to Josh or to anyone else in the world. And it makes perfect sense to do that. And we're excited. And I also want to thank you for Purdy's doing what it is doing. It's really exciting. And one of these days we'll get a chance to come up and visit, but that's in the future. We've seen a lot of crises this year over the past 12 months, especially, or 14 months about COVID-19. And you've illustrated exactly why there is a solution that can address those issues. And that is that most of those websites were not accessible. And there are ways to make the websites accessible, but it starts with an attitude of wanting to include. And we're really glad that all of you have done that, which really makes life exciting. What are you doing on a regular basis today just to keep everyone at Purdy's educated and excited about the fact that you're inclusive? Or is there anything that you need to do today? Is it a common, just part of what you do, or what?
We start with basics. So we use accessible guidelines as a starting point to plan for new experiences that we create. And it changed a way how we, for instance, create our emails. It's not necessarily part of our website, but that's an important extension. So we want to make sure that our emails, for instance, are also accessible. It is a process that requires multiple stakeholders working towards the same goal, and our goal is to be as much compliant as we possibly can be, because we know it reduces the attrition rate, and it creates more loyal customers in the long run. And it has become one of the, I would say, essential elements when it comes to the way we plan, the way we implement, and we also incorporating. We spend more time, let's put it this way, we spend more time to make sure that the user journey, the user experience is not only seamless, but it also has all these accessible components to that.
So important.
So you've obviously had a lot of customers come across your site. One of the discussions that a number of us in the disabilities community have had is about what happens when a website becomes accessible and a company makes the effort to do it. Do they get feedback? Have you heard from anyone since you've made your website accessible? Has anyone said, gee, that's great? Or has anyone given you any kind of feedback after visiting your site? Do you hear from anyone?
We receive a lot of feedback that's coming from multiple sources, and we actually, that's one of our strategic goals. We want to get to a specific NPS score, And I can tell you that we are ranking relatively high. Our NPS score is relatively high compared to other companies. And so that's an indicator for us and for our digital team that we are on the right track there.
That is exciting because a lot of times you go to a website and you use it and you don't think about the fact that behind that website are still people who want to hear that you appreciate what they've done. So it's great that you're getting feedback from people who will help you to understand the value and hopefully also help you do it better. We do tend to be a pretty vocal community, and we also, I think, a lot of us recognize the value in telling someone when they're doing a good job. But there are a lot of people that don't, and I think it's important for us as users to recognize that it's valuable for us to discuss the importance of what you're doing and thanking you for doing what you're doing
And
on a daily basis.
The education behind that, like I wish we weren't at this point within the accessibility gap, because right now we have hundreds of millions of websites that are not accessible. Less than 2% of websites are accessible based on the standards, which is not good. 2% is not good. But how do we grow from there? We have companies that decide to do something about it. When they do something about it, recognizing them now is so important to keep spreading the word of that access and inclusion on the internet is important. It's the future. It's our ability to access the world and have opportunities, whether it's an opportunity to learn or access COVID tests or eat delicious chocolate. All those are opportunities that anybody without a disability is able to navigate. And for us, or anybody with a disability that doesn't have that, it's you're only experiencing half of the picture or parts of the picture. So often when we talk about those other 98% of websites, yes, a lot of that website, you can interpret something on the site. You can see or click on certain things. But the fact is that if it's inaccessible, there's going to be things that are missing that you never know that are even there. And that makes it so difficult, whether you have low vision or blind, and you're missing 20% of the site. That 20% is really important. The website owner put that 20% on there for a reason. Or if for someone like myself, if there's a hyperlink that I don't know exists and I can't click on it, I can't get to the next page that's going to provide me the experience of what that website was made for. So it's just accessibility is just so important.
And that goes back to the point from before of when I looked at the website, there were images there that I knew were there only because my web screen reader said image, but there were also some that didn't even verbalize that. And when I activated accessiBe, suddenly they were there. And of course, whether you do it through accessiBe or somebody codes it, those are all important things to do. Even links, and you bring up a good point, Josh, that there are websites that have what are supposed to be links, but unless they get coded the correct way, if you're manually doing it, and accessiBe using its technology then also can see this is supposed to be a link that goes somewhere and addresses it. Either way, you've got to make that stuff accessible. You've got to make the appropriate adjustments to the website to make sure that screen readers can use it. So Yuri, in terms of what you have done and in terms of your thoughts and thinking back now to the whole issue of accessibility and so on, what kind of lessons have you learned about even better ways to implement it right from the outset? Or do you think your experience was seamless right from the beginning, and so you're just pleased with the way it went?
First of all, for us, just to follow the accessibility approach required some learning. And I can be very open and honest with that. But we made this decision because we understood the long-term value behind it. It shifted our mindsets now so that we include it in our daily activities when we work on product launches and whatnot. I'm happy with how accessiBe specifically works on our website and what it does for people with disabilities. We didn't experience any technical issues with the widget. We upgraded our systems multiple times manually, and we didn't notice any changes in the way how the tool is behaving on our website. So that's also a plus here. And overall, I think with the time goes on, I think we will only enhance and build on what we have right now.
That's great.
Excellent.
I will tell people who are listening, we're going to open this up for your questions in a little bit. You're welcome to ask any of us questions, but I have one more for Yuri before we do that. So get your questions ready or write them in the chat area, and we'll see them and we'll deal with them. But Yuri, last question for you. What would you say to businesses who are thinking about accessibility now? What advice would you give them, and what thoughts do you have for people who haven't gone where you've gone yet?
I think my advice would be to start planning for accessibility at the very beginning, if you can. If you're designing a website, or you're starting to design your website, start thinking about how accessible it can be and what challenges you may face when you start implementing some of these guidelines. At the same time, I would say it's as important nowadays, it's as important as to adhere to all the SEO practices. Because at the end of the day, accessibility and search engine optimization, they overlap. And that overlap, it's the difference between a stream of new customers and the lack of thereof. And it's traffic that converts, and that's traffic that is free. It's out there and it's free. You don't have to pay for it. It's not a digital ad. That's how you can streamline and improve your conversion rate at the end of the day. And this is how you can grow your revenue coming from the digital channel. In 2021, here and now, accessibility, I would say it's one of the cornerstones to make sure that you are getting the most out of your website, especially if you are a retailer or you have an e-com website.
Yeah, it's important to deal with inclusion and to deal with it now. We can't afford to continue to wait. The gap grows wider, and we've got to all collectively work together to narrow the gap. And we really appreciate what you're doing. If you don't mind, I would like to open this up to those who are listening to see if some people have some questions. Would that be okay with you?
So I got one in the chat, Mike.
Go Josh, but I also have one that already came before.
So who do you have there, Josh?
All right, so the question that I'm seeing in the chat is, does accessiBe deal with mobile browsers to make it accessible on a website?
Fair question. Yes. To be real blunt, unlike politicians who would take a minute and a half to answer this question, yes. I use accessiBe on my, I go to websites that have accessiBe on my iPhone, and I can activate accessiBe just like I can with my desktop machine. accessiBe is browser agnostic, and the result is that if I were to go to Purdy's chocolates with my iPhone, I would be able to get the same information that I get otherwise.
So that's for your phone, whether you have an Android, Apple, or if you have a tablet, all those make it.
It's a browser thing as opposed to a phone thing. Although I appreciate that you have to do things for phones, but the bottom line is that accessiBe works across browsers, which also does somewhat imply, but even more so, it's relevant to say it works across all phones and tablets as well.
So
yeah, and you had a question.
It's a question for you. So you spoke about bounce rate and how accessibility affects bounce rate. And the question is, and it's I guess a bit harder to correlate, but did you see or did you feel an impact on sales?
Absolutely. we absolutely see the impact on sales. Our conversion rate has gone up significantly, and that's on top of what we experienced during the lockdown. So I would say with the whole accessible experience, we are making sure that no matter what circumstances, or regardless of what circumstances someone's in, they have equal ability to discover our product.
Great.
And obviously they do.
Yeah. And we also have a question actually for Josh, that Josh, you mentioned the fact that accessibility has impact on brand loyalty. And Simon, actually our own Simon from accessiBe, is interested in this statement about how the disability community is being loyal, or how is it a more loyal community? If you can speak about it a little bit more.
So the reason why persons with disabilities it's not even just the persons with disability, it's their friends, it's their family members, it's their support team. All of us are on the same team, because it's the only way that I can survive in the community with my unique level of paralysis is with multiple people in my life. So when it comes to the disability community, which includes all of them, brand loyalty is all about having a website that is chosen to be welcoming. So when you implement access and inclusion to your website, it tells me that you care, that you want me to be a part of your website. But at the same time, it then gives me the ability to experience your website like everybody else. And if I can't experience your website like everybody else, I'm not going to have a good experience. And I'm not going to be a favorable reviewer. I'm going to be one that says, I wish I could have, or you know what, the only way that I could use your website was to ask a caregiver to come over and click this button, and then I was able to check out. But being able to give persons with disabilities the independence to experience your site, like I'm very dependent on my caregivers to access the world. I'm dependent on technology to access the world, but I actually flip it around. Because I have my caregivers, I think of them as my hands. I have my technology with my mouth control, voice dictation on my computer that gives me the ability to access the internet and my computer as well. And those tools, those people in my life allow me to be independent, because with them, I'm able to do great things, basically whatever my mind tells me I would like to do. So the brand loyalty component is, if you have an accessible website, that person could use those services and experience it in the way that it's supposed to be experienced. And they're going to want to come back, because they're going to want to have that same experience again and again. And they're going to want to recommend it to their friends and their family, because unfortunately, with only 2% of websites being inaccessible, we don't have that much to choose from. And this is the same for any business that you call up from the phone book. If you end up having a good experience with that business, you're going to recommend it. If you're going to have a bad experience, you're not going to recommend it. But websites have a clear choice on whether they want to be accessible and inclusive to the disability population. And I hope they do the right thing, and I hope that they recognize that there's guidelines and standards out there.
Yeah, to add, go ahead.
You go, Mike.
And to add to that, the issue about brand loyalty, Simon, I also have ways to use assistance from people to do things online or do things that are inaccessible. I use, for example, a service called IRA, AIRA, that uses a visual interpreter, somebody who's highly trained to describe whatever a camera sees on my phone, or when I'm dealing with online things at home here, I will use TeamViewer, which is a product that allows someone to see what's on my screen and even to interact and help click things that I can't. But still, if I can interact directly, that's huge. If I can do it myself, that's a big deal to me, as it is for most people, because we want to be able to do as much as we can on our own. I don't mind the assistance, but I love it when I can go to a site and just be able to use it. And that's, of course, what Purdy's has done. And as Yuri has said, he's gotten a lot of good feedback about that, which is also great. But it's important to be able to have the opportunity to be included. And that's a big part of everything that we interact with today. And if somebody sends me a message that I want and value you because they make their website accessible, that is a huge thing, because especially today with the numbers being so low of accessible websites, then we need to be able to, or we want to be able to express our loyalty. Do we have other questions?
We have another question, and I think that's going to be the last one. And it's actually an interesting question and an interesting suggestion, asking if we can, if there is a push to get websites to make accessible upfront, and if not, if they're not making the website accessible, to prevent the website from being published. And as a suggestion, it's a good suggestion. And I would just say that even if it's possible to stop from any inaccessible website to be published until it's accessible, you still have more than 300 million websites out there which are already published and are not accessible.
Well,
so still need to make them accessible.
Let's look at that a slightly different way. It's a really good question and an interesting thought. I'm all in favor of it, but it's an interesting thought. That is, let's deal with the first part of it. What about websites being accessible right from the outset? Technically, that is very doable, but it isn't going to happen until those people who design the products and tools and processes that make websites accessible, until those people incorporate absolute mandates that accessibility has to be built in right from the outset and has to be carried forward once the website is created, it isn't going to happen.
Or at the very least, let's say, at least providing an element of education, saying that your website should be accessible for these reasons.
Oh, they'll say they do that today to a degree. So that's why I took it further. It isn't going to happen until accessibility and inclusion are mandated at the development stage right from the outset. There are a number of people who are involved in website remediation and involved in coding today who say that the only way to truly make the internet accessible is to do it right from the outset. Not the only way, but certainly the best way. And the reality is, if people truly made products accessible right from the outset, then there would be a lot more inclusion, but they're not doing it. And there's nothing to compel people to do that. Until that changes, we're going to all deal with doing this the way we are. That is to say, we're going to find mechanisms that will make our websites accessible. We're going to hire people to do it. We're going to use accessiBe to do it. And all of those ways work. Should we not publish a website until it's accessible? I wouldn't say to do that, but rather go back to the beginning. Mandate it from the outset, and then if somebody figures out a way around it, then don't publish the website. But freedom of speech and so on hasn't yet been accepted as including full inclusion and accessibility. And so it's a challenge that we have. Before we close, I'd like to see if Yuri has any final comments or any other thoughts that you'd like to tell us all.
Mike, there was a second part about it. So we're talking about hundreds of millions of websites, not just in the initial days of getting websites on the internet, but the current ones that exist. We all have to come together in a kind of a united front of coming up with solutions that can start tackling this huge problem that we have. So there's the traditional ways that have not been able to cut it at this point of making the internet accessible, but now that we have scalable solutions that can be done quickly and without much financial burden, and really also not much time burden, like so many businesses have bandwidth issues. And the fact if you can make it affordable and timely, that is two major important pieces of making the internet more accessible. So now with scalable solutions like accessiBe, it's just getting that out to the masses is going to help bridge that gap, in my opinion.
Yuri, any final thoughts?
Just to summarize, why do you need to prioritize web accessibility? First of all, the main purpose of that is to create a connection with your customers. Digital accessibility in general, it makes good economic sense. It increases revenue opportunities. It's also good for SEO, and it helps to show up higher on Google and other search engines. And in some cases, it's even legally required. So I would say for companies out there that you need to prioritize web accessibility because it will come up at some point, but it would be better for you to start planning for that ahead, because sometimes, even for large organizations, it's challenging to embark on these projects, and sometimes it requires a lot of effort to get this done. So if you can start thinking about accessibility at the very beginning, before you even starting creating mockups, that will help in the long run.
Thank you, both Josh and Yuri, for being here. Yuri, especially, we really appreciate your insights. As we conclude, I do want to tell you all that if anyone has any thoughts of things that they would like to see us cover in future webinars discussing the accessibility gap, please feel free to email me. Again, I'm Michael Hinkson. And my email address is Michael, Michaelhi, at accessiBe.com. So Michaelhi at accessiBe.com. We'd love to hear from you. Would love to hear your thoughts. Would appreciate it if you would tell others about what we're doing. And we'll keep you all certainly apprised as we have more of these webinars. We'll be doing one next month at some point. Consumer conventions are coming up, and that's going to probably change dates a little bit, but we will keep you posted. And we want to thank you all for attending today. We hope you found this helpful, and you'll go off and tell other people. And please encourage people to help us bridge the accessibility gap. Thanks again.